Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into something pretty fundamental today, something you've all been asking about. How students learn when they get to university. Do they actually change how they learn just from being there? We're going to get to the bottom of it all. So if you want to understand the cutting edge research on this, well, stick with us.
Yeah, and you all sent in a ton of questions about this awesome systematic review paper. It pulls together 43 different studies.
Wow, 43.
Yeah. And this isn't just, opinions or anything. It's hardcore educational psychology research. And they're all focused on this idea. Do students just naturally become, deeper learners the longer they're at university?
Right, because I think a lot of people just assume, going to university is I don't know, flipping a switch in your brain, and suddenly you're a deep learner. But is that really true?
It's a really common assumption. I mean, we kind of hope that university education doesn't just give graduates a bunch of knowledge, but also, helps them think critically and just keep learning their whole lives, right?
Yeah.
And this deep approach to learning is kind of at the heart of that.
Okay, so get ready, folks, because we're about to unpack what this huge review actually found. And be warned, you might have to say goodbye to some of those assumptions about automatic deep learning at university. It's more complicated than that.
For sure. Maybe we should start with, what do researchers even mean when they talk about approaches to learning? What is a deep approach anyway?
Right, yeah. So a deep approach is all about really trying to understand the material, deep down. Students who are using a deep approach, they're actively thinking about it, engaging with the ideas, trying to see the big picture and the main themes. And they're using, strategies that help them build a strong understanding, not just skimming the surface.
Okay, got it. So what about, the opposite, the surface approach?
Yeah, you got it. The surface approach is kind of what it sounds like. It's more about just getting by, memorizing facts, maybe just enough to pass the test. The motivation isn't really about learning for the sake of it. It's more about avoiding failure or just meeting the minimum requirements.
And sometimes you see this third approach too, the strategic or achieving approach. How's that different from deep and surface?
Yeah. The strategic approach isn't so much about how deeply you engage with the material, but more about how you organize your studying. Are you really focused on what's going to be on the test? It's about getting the best grades by being smart about what and how you study.
Oh, so it's you can be strategic about using a deep approach or a surface approach. It's about your overall approach to study.
Exactly. Now, these ideas aren't exactly new, are they?
Not at all. I mean, go back to the 70s.
Oh.
Yeah, researchers like Martin and Celio, they were doing this really cool research on how students read academic texts. And they saw this clear difference. Some students were just trying to remember the words, surface level stuff, but others were digging deeper, really grappling with the meaning, trying to get to the author's main message.
Right. And what was so important about their work was that they also found that students could change their approach based on what they thought the task required. If they thought they just needed to remember facts, they'd use a surface approach. But if they felt like they needed to actually understand it, boom, they'd shift to a deeper approach.
It's like they were adapting to the situation.
Yeah, it really shows how the learning environment and what students think they need to do can, totally shape how they learn. And then building on that, there was Svensson with his ideas about holistic versus atomistic approaches, and Pask, who talked about holistic versus serialistic strategies. It's all about seeing the big picture versus getting stuck in the details, or about understanding through connections versus learning step by step. All different ways to understand how engaged someone is with their learning.
So we've got these different approaches to learning, but the big question this review tackled is, do students at university actually get better at using this deep approach just by being there? Do they automatically become deeper learners?
Right. The assumption is that as students spend more time at uni, they just become more critical thinkers, they engage more deeply with the material, they become lifelong learners, the whole package.
So drum roll, please. What did they actually find?
Well, get this. The review of these 43 studies, it painted a pretty messy picture. They didn't find strong, clear evidence that students consistently become deeper learners just because they're at university.
Really? Wow, that's surprising. So what did they find specifically about changes in the deep approach?
Okay, so for the deep approach, 18 studies did report a positive trend. Students seem to be using deeper strategies more as they went through their programs. But, and this is important, another 18 studies found no real change. Statistically, their deep approach didn't budge.
So it's 50-50 so far.
Yeah, and here's the kicker. 8 studies actually found a decrease in deep approaches over time. And then another 6 studies showed that it totally depended on the individual student. Some got deeper, some didn't, some even got less deep.
So no clear pattern there at all. What about the surface approach? Was there more consistency in how that changed over time?
Not really. For the surface approach, 11 studies found it decreased, which you might expect if students were becoming deeper learners, right? But then 9 studies actually found an increase in surface approaches. And the biggest chunk, 20 studies, found no changes at all. And again, 6 studies said it really varied from student to student.
Okay, so basically, the research is all over the place.
Yep.
There's no consistent pattern of students becoming deeper learners or abandoning surface learning just from being at uni. Why is that?
Yeah, why? Well, the authors of the review dug deep into this, and they looked at both the ideas behind learning approaches, like the theoretical stuff and how the studies themselves were done, the methods. Let's start with the theory stuff. One big issue they pointed out is that this whole field of student approaches to learning, which they call SALL for short.
So, got it.
Yeah, SLA. It doesn't have a really clear, solid theoretical base. They even called it a swamp.
A swamp. That's harsh.
Yeah, well, they're basically saying that there's no one agreed upon definition of these approaches to learning. There are different frameworks out there like Biggs and Innisel, Vermont, and others. And while they're all kind of related, they each have their own little quirks about what deep and surface learning really mean.
Ah, I see. So different studies might be talking about slightly different things when they say deep learning. That makes comparing them tricky.
Exactly. Like, for example, Biggs includes this idea of a deep motive, which is about being interested in the subject and enjoying learning for the sake of it. And he also talks about a deep strategy, which is about actively trying to make meaning. But in Whistle, he's more focused on the cognitive processes, like relating ideas and using evidence. It's similar to Pask's earlier ideas about understanding through connections rather than learning in a linear, step-by-step way. So they're all getting at similar ideas, but the emphasis and the details can be different.
Okay, so even if studies are using the same term, they might not be measuring exactly the same thing. But did the review find problems even among studies that use the same theoretical framework?
You bet. Even when studies use the same framework, like say they both used big study process questionnaire, they still ended up with different conclusions about whether deep learning increased, decreased, or just stayed the same. So clearly there's more to the story than just having a shared vocabulary.
Right. And didn't the review also talk about how the type of research in this area has changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great point. In the early days, researchers like Martin and Selyu, they were focused on specific learning situations, like how students process particular texts or tackled particular tasks. But as time went on, especially with these longitudinal studies that follow students over their whole degree, there's been a shift towards measuring more general learning orientations, like a student's overall tendency to be a deep or surface learner across all their courses.
And the review authors suggest that this shift might be part of the problem.
Exactly. They argue that while we're trying to see this general development of learning approaches, we might be overlooking the impact of each course's specific context. Think about it. The subject itself, how the course is taught, what kind of assessments are used, even the individual teacher. All of that can massively influence how you approach learning in that specific course.
So you're saying we're looking for a general trend while ignoring the very things that we know can make learning approaches change in the first place.
Bingo. And this leads to another concern they raise, which is about the tools used to measure these learning approaches.
Yeah.
A lot of these longitudinal studies used questionnaires like Biggs's SPQ, which were originally designed for looking at learning approaches within a specific course. So the review authors are questioning whether it's really appropriate to use those same tools to measure general development over years and years across tons of different courses without at least considering if they need to be adjusted.
Makes you think. So we've talked about the conceptual challenges. What about the methodological issues? What did the review say about how the studies were actually conducted?
Yeah, well, there were a few key issues. One was the different ways studies analyze their data. A lot of them, 27 out of the 37 quantitative studies, use these older statistical methods like repeated measures ANOVA, which
Yeah.
basically looks at changes in average scores over time.
Right.
But fewer studies used more advanced methods like latent profile analysis, which can actually identify different groups of students with distinct learning patterns. So it's like the older methods look at the average change for everyone, but the newer methods can help us see if there are different types of learners who are changing in different ways.
Oh, I see. Like maybe some students start out as deep learners and stay that way, while others start out surface and then become deeper and so on.
Exactly. And another issue was how many times they actually measured students in these studies. A majority of them, 25 out of 43, only collected data twice. And the review points out that with just two snapshots, it's really hard to understand how things are actually developing. You can't see the whole trajectory of change.
It's like trying to understand a movie by only watching the first and last scenes.
Exactly. They also mentioned that it limits what kind of statistical analyses you can do, and they even brought up this statistical thing called regression to the mean, which can be a problem when you only have two data points.
So ideally, having more measurement points over time would give a much better picture of how learning approaches actually evolve.
Totally. They acknowledge that it's tough to keep students involved in a study over several years, what they call subject attrition. But they suggest that having at least three or more measurement points would be much better for studying development. Interestingly, they also found that even those studies that did use more advanced methods and had more measurement points, they still didn't consistently find that everyone shifts towards deeper learning.
Hmm. And I remember the review talking about how looking at changes for the whole group, like the average change, might actually mask changes that are happening for individuals or subgroups.
Yeah, they discuss that a lot. It's like if you only look at the average change for everyone, you might miss the fact that some students are becoming much deeper learners, while others are actually becoming more surface-oriented, and those changes just cancel each other out in the average. They also discussed how a deep approach might need to be there in the first place to really develop.
Oh, so you're saying someone who's already inclined towards deep learning might be more likely to get even deeper at university, whereas someone who's starting out as a surface learner might not change as much.
Exactly. It's like they might have a disposition to understand, as some researchers call it.
It's like that.
And they also talk about how having similar learning environments throughout university might lead to stability in approaches.
Right, if all your courses are designed in a way that encourages surface learning, then maybe you're not going to see much development towards a deep approach.
Exactly. And the review actually found that more studies reported no change in the surface approach than in the deep approach when looking at group averages. But then, when they looked at studies that used what are called person-oriented analyses,
Person-oriented analyses.
yeah, it's a fancy way of saying they look at the learning journeys of individual students and tried to find groups of students who changed in similar ways. Those studies consistently showed that different students develop in different ways based on their starting point. So basically, this individual variation could explain why we don't see consistent findings when we just look at group averages.
Like everyone's on their own learning journey.
Exactly. Now, one final methodological point the review made was about the fact that all these studies relied on students just reporting on their own learning approaches. Like, they used questionnaires where students had to describe how they learn.
Right, so it's all based on self-report data.
Yeah. And the authors suggest that future research needs to find other ways to understand how students learn, or at least combine self-reports with other kinds of data, like maybe look at actual study behaviors or things like that.
Get a more complete picture.
Exactly. They call it data triangulation. And to be fair, the review itself acknowledges that it might have some limitations too.
Like what?
Well, they pointed out that they only searched three main academic databases for relevant studies, so maybe if they'd included more sources, they would have found slightly different results overall.
Makes sense. So after considering all this evidence, what was the main takeaway message from the review authors?
Well, they basically argued that trying to see if deep learning develops at the group level might be a dead end for research,
Hmm.
especially given all the disagreements about what deep learning even means, the lack of clear evidence, and the fact that we're ignoring context when we know it matters so much.
A dead end. Wow. So what do they think researchers should focus on instead?
They suggest shifting back to studying learning in specific context, like how students learn in a particular course or on a specific topic, or even when doing a specific task. They also recommend looking at other theoretical models that might explain expertise development and learning change over time better.
So back to basics, in a way.
Yeah, kind of. They want us to get back to studying learning in clear, well-defined situations, like the early researchers did, and to be more creative about how we measure learning approaches.
So for our listeners out there, what's the big takeaway from all of this? What should they remember from this deep dive?
I think the key message is this. The idea that going to university automatically turns you into a deep, critical thinker. Well, the research just doesn't back that up. It's way more complicated than that. There are huge differences between students, and the learning environment plays a big role. So yeah, that automatic upgrade to deep thinker that university supposedly gives you, maybe not so much.
That raises a really interesting question for all of you listening. What does this mean for how we think about the purpose of higher education? Does this research challenge any of your own experiences at university? Did you automatically become a deep learner, or was it more complicated than that?
It's worth reflecting on your own experiences, Think back to different courses you took. Were there any specific courses or teaching methods that you felt really pushed you to engage more deeply with the material?
Because at the end of the day, truly understanding how students learn, instead of just relying on these big assumptions, is crucial for figuring out how to teach more effectively and support student learning in higher education. And this deep dive suggests that becoming a deep learner isn't automatic. It's a journey that needs a more nuanced approach, both in research and in the classroom.